Hi there, this is the Spiritual and Political Podcast. I'm Alan Zundell, and today I'm going to be talking about independent voters, particularly a recent CNN poll, recent meaning about a month ago it was released, having to do with how independents see themselves and how they tend to vote. So before I get into that, I'm going to be talking about some other things having to do with the California Top 2 system, because that will tie in at the end to proposals for reforming the political process in order to better include independent voters and to address some of their dissatisfaction with the two-party system. All right, so first of all, let's take a look at how many people are now calling themselves or think about themselves as independents. And for that, we are jumping over to a graph here that was composed by responses to Gallup poll asking voters whether they identified with the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, or as an independent. And then more recently, CNN has done similar types of polls of adults in the United States of voting age. I'm not sure if they're all registered voters or not. I'd have to double check that. But the general trend here, as you can see if you're looking at it on your video screen, rather than listening to this as an audio podcast, the number of people identifying as independents has gone up to 44% over the last, 35 years or so. Now, independents definitely outnumber either Republicans or Democrats at 44%. Democrats are down at 27%, and Republicans pretty much even with them at 28% of this. When you include the margin of error, of course, they're pretty much neck and neck. But independents, definitely many more people regard themselves as independents, and that is why this is an important topic to be covering. But before I get into that, let me quickly talk about something else I had been talking about over and over, and this is a court case here in California that was brought by a few third parties, or alternative parties, as I prefer to call them, the Peace and Freedom Party, the Libertarian Party, and later on joined by the American Solidarity Party. I think the Green Party is involved as well. Another thing I didn't double check before I started talking. They brought a court case against the state of California, Secretary of State of California, saying that the Top 2 system deprived them of some of their constitutional rights. Now, Top 2 system has what is called these days an open primary. That word has different meanings in different contexts, but the general idea is that all of the candidates from all of the parties and independents as well, they all run in one election, no matter if you got 5 Democrats, 13 Republicans, 10 independents, and several minor party candidates. They're all running in the same primary election, and all the voters, no matter which party or non-party they identify with, get to vote in that election. With the Top 2 system here in California and in Washington as well, whichever two candidates get the most votes are the ones that go to the general election, the only ones that go to the general election. So all these left out parties are saying this is against their constitutional rights, as well as a number of voters were part of that case as well, saying their voting rights were restricted because they couldn't vote for candidates that they actually wanted or parties that actually represented them. The news here is that they kept postponing this trial, and the most recent postponement that I mentioned to you was that it was supposed to be taking place. The case was going to hold hearing on October 24th, which is this coming Friday. Well, the judge postponed the case again without giving any reason to February 27th of next year, 2026. Now, that's not time enough to do the case, have a determination, and change the primary system that we're going to be holding in 2026, because ballots go out on May 6th, 5th, 4th, May 4th, 2026. Ballots in California go out, and then the last day for turning in your ballot is June 9th, which means that between the first hearing of this court case, if it doesn't get delayed again, in February, and the ballots going out in May, there's only a couple of months there, so they wouldn't have time to redo their ballots and change the system and all that. So even if the court finds against the top two system, I think the outcome of this is going to be, or at least they seem to be anticipating that it's going to be not requiring the state of California to make any changes, at least not right away. I would hope they find that they do need to make a change, because I'm not a fan of the top two system for reasons I'll get into in a little bit. And what else did I want to say about that? I read the briefs for this, and it seemed like the parties had a good case against the system. Whether a judge will agree with me or not is another question. All right, so enough of that. Once again, the top two system case has been postponed, and it's important because there is an organization called Open Primaries, which has been promoting not the top two system, but an open primary type election where it could be the top two that go to the general election, or it could be the top five and use something like ranked choice voting then in the general election to choose between them, or the top four and using ranked choice voting. They had a number of ballot initiatives last election in November, but they didn't do too well, especially combining open primary and ranked choice voting did not seem to go over well with the voters. And I think just about all of them failed, with a few exceptions, like in the District of Columbia, but the statewide ones failed, so did not do very well. Let's get into who are the independent voters, because the open primary organization and movement is claiming to address the concerns of independents by promoting this type of reform, like we have here in California and they have in Alaska, variations of it, but I don't think it's working very well to address their concerns. So who are the independents? Finally getting around to that subject after a lot of a roundabout here. Let's go to the CNN poll. This is CNN did with the SSRS research team. I don't know who they are. This was released in September, which shows you how lackadaisical I've been lately about keeping up with news and getting this podcast on air. I don't think I've done a podcast in about a week now, even though I intended to follow up the last one with some of this political news. I've been busy, so what are you going to do? Sue me? Let's see. So that's the CNN poll. And what they came up with was that, according to their answers, asking people who identify as independents how they see themselves and whether they lean toward one major party or another, they came up with 5 categories here. You see them listed on your screen: the upbeat outsiders, the disappointed middle, the Democratic lookalikes, the Republican lookalikes, and the checked out. Now let's look at that latter 3 first on the right of your screen, because those are the ones that are most familiar. And I would say that past attempts to find out who these voters are have been very similar to this, especially these latter 3 categories. So what are they about? About a quarter of the independents, 24%, are what they call Democratic lookalikes. 83% of them say they lean Democratic when they vote. They mostly vote for Democrats, but half of them have an unfavorable view of the Democratic Party. And about half of them, not half of the ones who have unfavorable views, but half of them overall, call themselves progressives more than Democrats. And very few of them overall call themselves liberals. So this, I take it, is a category that generally votes Democratic, that lean toward Democratic positions, but they call themselves independent because they don't want to be identified with a party that, my guess is, they didn't say this, but my guess is they see the party as corrupt and not progressive enough, that is simply serving the interest of big billionaires, just like the Republicans are seen as well. So this is mostly people who, by default, tend to vote Democratic. And they're not necessarily going to turn toward an independent candidate unless they look like a Democrat or strongly progressive. The Republican lookalikes, very similar, but half the number of independents identify this way. Republican lookalikes, about 83%, same as those Democrat lookalikes who lean Democratic. 83% of the Republican lookalikes lean Republican and mostly vote Republican in election. 92% of them voted for Donald Trump in this last presidential election, 2024. So, who are these people? I would say they're primarily people that are disgusted with both parties and feel that parties are, again, corrupt, just like the the Democratic lookalikes, but they like Trump for whatever reason. They see him as an antidote to parties, not strictly a example of a Republican candidate, but something sui generis, which means unique and one of a kind. They see Trump as addressing their concerns, but not necessarily Republicans in general. So very few of those. Then the checked out, bigger than either of those other two categories, around a quarter of them as well. 27% of the people who identify as independent are checked out. And this is familiar to me as well. It means either they don't bother to register to vote or they don't vote if they are registered, like in states that have automatic voter registration. Three-quarters of them don't really pay attention to politics, and 9 in 10 of them, that is the vast majority, say no one in politics really speaks for people like them. How they would know that if they're not paying attention is left unexplained. But this is people who are generally just not interested in politics. They are more concerned about other things, making ends meet, or just dealing with day-to-day stuff, or they'd rather be entertained by other means than watching the political mudfest on cable TV or the internet. So these are familiar categories. There's people who think of themselves as independents but lean strongly Democratic because they don't like what the party seems to have become, or maybe it's been for a long time, but what it is now. The Republican lookalikes, again, they call themselves independent because they don't really like the Republican Party, even though they mostly vote that way. They seem to really like Trump, though. And then the checked out is people who just are not that interested or don't have time for it, don't make it a priority. So who are these other two categories on the left of your screen? They are more unfamiliar. Let's take that one called the disappointed middle. This is 16% of the independent voters, the self-identified independent voters. And they are what you might think of when you think of an independent voter. They're the folks who are interested in politics, so they're not checked out, but they're very disappointed in both of the major parties. They have said that they have voted for independents or even alternative party candidates in the past, and they are the ones who say both parties, both of the major parties, are too extreme. So they are called the disappointed middle. They are the centrists that we hear about all the time, that the major parties are told they should be trying to solicit their support and move more towards the center. This is particularly true in the Democratic Party. We always hear that Democrats should move towards the center in order to attract more of the disappointed middle. Well, they're going to find that this is a small percentage of the voting population, even if they could bring them aboard. And I assume that sometimes they do, because really, how often do you even have choices of independent candidates? They're not always on the ballot. So if the Democrats do that, they move towards the center. Who are they losing, though? All these progressive Democratic lookalikes, a big chunk of that 24%, so about 12%, are saying, okay, the Democrats are moving even farther from what I'd like to see, so they're going to lose some of them, maybe either to alternative parties like the Green Party, or even more likely, they'll just sit it out, which is what happened in the 2024 election. A lot of the Democratic leaners simply said, I'm not that excited about Joe Biden, and I'm not excited about Kamala Harris, who seems to be a Joe Biden knockoff. So I'm not even going to bother to vote. And that's a big part of the reason that the Democrats lost the presidential election. They just couldn't bring aboard some of the folks who feel like the party is going in the wrong direction. So that's the disappointed middle, the ones that you generally might think of as independents, or the ones who are always talked about as what independents are about. Just a small percentage of the actual people who call themselves independents. The upbeat outsiders, now this is a strange category and new to me. I had never heard this used before. So who are they? The upbeat outsiders, they're pretty happy with the way things are going in the country. Don't know who that might be. But they say they agree with the Democrats on some issues and with the Republicans on other issues. So they're not really strongly identified with either because they like a mix of them. They feel okay, I said, with the state of the country, but they're very busy. They're too busy to pay much attention to politics and to take the time to vote often. So that's because they're more likely to be young and urban and of a relatively lower middle class income, say under $50,000 a year, which means their parents, they're struggling to make ends meet, and they got their hands full. So they may be interested in politics. They may be happy in general with how things are going, but they're not sure which party they identify with because they're not able to really pay a lot of attention given that they have kids to raise and jobs to take care of, and maybe two jobs per family or more, or maybe even unemployed and having to find jobs. So that is the categories for that CNN came up with to describe what they are finding among independent voters. Okay, so given that the independent voters are relatively diverse in their reasons for being independents and how they view the two major parties, what can we do to attract them back to the political system? Now, the open primary folks have been, as I said, pushing this idea of all the candidates in one primary election, all the voters get to vote among them. That way, independents have a voice in who becomes the big candidates, right? So the usual complaint is you just have a Democrat and Republican, and I don't really like either of them. So I don't even get to choose who gets to be the Democrat or Republican. I'm just left out of the system. So they want to bring them into the primaries in order to give them a role in that. And the open primaries, folks, let me show you what they're about because they still have some campaigns going on. Here they said open primary campaigns across the country. This is the Open Primaries Organization. From Oklahoma to Florida, from New Mexico to Pennsylvania, from New York to Oregon, citizen leaders all across the country are coming together to build campaigns for open primaries, at least what they're calling open primaries now. And they give you several of the logos of those different campaigns. And as I said, the campaigns that they had in 2024 did not do very well. Well, after the CNN poll was released, the president of the Open Primary Organization, John Updike, published an editorial online. I'm not sure if it was printed anywhere else, but he propagated it to his followers of the organization. And here is the bottom line in his summary. Don't be fooled by the categories generated by the smarty pants at CNN. They perpetuate the self-serving myth that independents are not truly independent. By that, I assume they mean that many of them lean and tend to vote for one of the major parties or the other, whereas really the CNN thing said that was only like, what, approximately 40% or so of them. The real work is not to invent catchy categories that create the illusion of understanding, presumably understanding the independent voter. He has better insight into them somehow, his psychic powers. It is to recreate and reform our political process to fully include independents, the largest group of voters in the country. All right. I have no beef with giving independents more of a role in the country. I would much see myself in that position. My views are not represented by any of the parties. I'm probably closest to the Green Party, but the way the system is set up, the two-party system marginalizes the Greens. But here is the rub. We have the open primaries here in California, and they have them in Washington as well. How well are they actually doing? Well, they allow independents to vote in the primary, but the results do not seem to be very different. We have Republicans and Democrats winning the vast majority of times. When you do have an independent candidate, they don't attract a very large percentage of the votes. And the alternative party candidates don't do any better than they do in other states where they're able to get on the ballot. So it doesn't seem to change how the outcome is in terms of which kind of parties maintain power. we still have pretty much a two-party system here in California and in the other states that have attempted the open primary concept. That's one thing. So not a lot of change in who gets elected. Now, maybe you say, because the independents get to vote in the primary, instead of having a Democrat as the nominee of their party who is the most left-leaning, excuse me, my voice is giving out, maybe you could get a more moderate Democrat. Doesn't seem likely given the kind of categories we saw. Or maybe if it is a Republican who gets into the top two, it would be a more moderate Republican, rather than a more right-leaning or MAGA-leaning, I guess would be the extreme. Hasn't happened. Washington and California each have the open primary, and they have two of the most partisan state legislatures in the nation. So it doesn't seem to be changing the level of partisanship, and it is not helping to elect independents and minor party candidates, alternative party candidates. And finally, there is the idea that it's going to solve the problems of our system in general. Well, the biggest problem in our system is called vote splitting. That is the lesser evil problem. If you only get to choose one candidate, and the candidate who has more votes than others is the one that's going to advance or win in the case of the typical kind of election in the United States, or in a top two system, most votes gets into the general election. Top five, top four, doesn't matter. The more votes you have, the more likely you are to get, into office eventually. But that means that if you have more candidates of similar views, but slight differences between them, those voters are going to be split between them. The voters who like the general direction of two or three different candidates, but each voter is going in a different direction to choose those candidates, that splits the vote between those candidates. And that means that they're less likely to get into the general election or to be elected in the general election, simply because the votes are split up among their potential supporters. So if right wing has only one candidate, they'll be able to consolidate the right wing vote. If the left wing has five candidates, they'll split the left wing voters among them, and that means they won't get elected, right? So open primaries doesn't do anything to address these vote splitting problem. Now, it is true that if you combine it with ranked choice voting, it would somewhat ameliorate the lesser evil problem, because you can rank candidates, and then it has some effect on the ultimate outcome. But there is a big exception to ranked choice voting's vote splitting bona fides or bona fides, is that if you have a strong centrist candidate, that you could have vote splitting there as well. I won't go into the details of that, but we saw it in Alaska, where actually the candidate who was most in the center of the spectrum between the Republican, who was Sarah Palin, pretty far right, and the Democratic candidate, the candidate who was a Republican but was a little more centrist, he lost the election because there was vote splitting between the Republicans, between those who supported him, those who supported Palin, and together they would have elected a Republican. But because that candidate got knocked out in the penultimate round of the voting, didn't get into the general election, didn't win. So in none of these ways that the open primary system has been promoted does it actually work the way it doesn't do anything to give us different candidates winning, like all independent or alternative party candidates. It doesn't really solve the vote splitting problem unless you combine it with ranked choice voting, and then it only partially solves the problem, and it doesn't really address the partisanship. So I don't know why they're promoting it continually, maybe because they are impervious to the evidence, or maybe there's something I don't know. That's always a possibility. Show me something that would change my mind, and I'm likely to really struggle with it. But eventually, I think I could come around with good evidence. I hope I could. So that's it for this show. That's my take on independent politics. Now, what is it that I think would make a difference? For one thing, star voting for single seat elections would be the best system that I'm aware of. Star voting is when you can Give scores candidates on a scale from 0 to 5. Each candidate you get to have a say in. I like this one the most, like this one almost as much, that one not at all. So we get to, give some sense of how strongly you support candidates, and it should elect candidates who have the widest and strongest voter support. Much better than what we have now, and not that complex, certainly not more complex than ranked choice voting or the combination of open primaries and ranked choice voting. Pretty simple concept. Or proportional representation. There's a lot of forms of it out there. I don't like the ranked choice voting form of it. It's too complicated for voters to understand the outcome, I think. They could, of course, you can if you apply yourself to it, but most voters don't want to have to think about how is my vote translated into the results. I want to understand that without having to take a lot of time to think about it. So the kind of proportional representation I would favor is one. I'm not sure where they have this. I think they have it in other countries, at least one. Is one in which you get to vote both. You get two votes, essentially. You get to vote for a party and you get to vote for a candidate in your district. So you could choose among the candidates, pick the one you like best, and then choose among the parties, pick the one you like best. And then when it comes to the election, this would only work not in a single seat election, but for a body like a legislative body. Think of state legislatures or the House of Representatives in the Congress. What happens is you take the party percentage of the vote and assign so many seats for each party in correspondence with that. So in the party vote, if the Democrats got 39%, they would get roughly 39% of the seats, and the Republicans got 28. They get about 28% of the seats. Greens get 5%. They get 5% of the seats. Independents got about, 6% of the vote. They get 6% of the seats. And then the candidates who take those seats would be the ones who got the most votes out of the districts. So the Democrats get, what did I say? I don't know, 37% of the seats. First one goes to the candidate in the district who got the most votes out of all the Democratic candidates. Second one goes to the Democrat who got the next most votes of all the candidates. Same thing with the Republican Party, same thing with the Independents, same thing with the Green Party. All right. I should have taken a lot more time to explain that, right? But the idea is there are alternatives to the open primary idea. I really don't understand why they're leaning so much into that. I guess it's the myth that all independents really are centrist, and somehow allowing independents into the open primary would bring out more centrist candidates. Don't know. All right, I've talked way too much. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being patient with me, and hope to be here again soon if I can find something to say. All right, bye.